Chapter 1, The Architecture of Silence. The conference room on the 7th floor had no windows. This was intentional, though the building's architect had called it a design choice in the original blueprints. Marcus Chen had always found that phrase amusing, as if every decision in a federal building wasn't calculated, weighed, and approved by committees that left nothing to chance. He arrived at 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday in late September, 13 minutes early, which was his habit. The hallways were empty, just as he'd expected. Most of the department had cleared out by 5:30, eager to reclaim what remained of their daylight. Marcus could hear the distant hum of industrial-grade air conditioning, the kind that worked overtime to compensate for sealed environments. The fluorescent lights overhead gave everything a flat, shadowless quality, another intentional choice, he imagined. No place for darkness to hide in a building full of investigators. He carried nothing but his phone, which he powered down completely before reaching the door. Not just airplane mode, off. He'd learned this distinction early in his career, back when he still believed that protocols were designed to protect the work rather than the workers. The room was smaller than he remembered. Rectangular, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a table that could seat 8 but tonight would host only 3. The chairs were ergonomic, government-issued, the kind that cost taxpayers $200 apiece and still managed to be uncomfortable. A water pitcher sat in the center of the table, condensation already forming on its glass surface, surrounding 3 empty tumblers that caught the overhead light like small, transparent monuments. Marcus chose the chair with its back to the door. Another habit, though this one made him feel slightly ashamed. It was a tell, he knew, a signal that he expected confrontation, that he wanted to see whoever entered rather than be seen first. In his 14 years with the agency, he'd learned to read rooms almost as well as he read case files. This room, windowless and silent, read like a confession box designed by people who'd never confessed to anything. He checked his watch, 6:51. His pulse was steady, but his jaw ached from tension he hadn't consciously noticed. He tried to relax it, rolled his shoulders, listened to the small pops of cartilage realigning. 9 more minutes. The investigation had taken 11 months. 11 months of document reviews, source interviews, encrypted communications, and careful documentation of a pattern that, once you saw it, seemed impossible to unsee. Marcus had built cases before, corruption cases, fraud schemes, conspiracies that spiderwebbed through institutions he'd once trusted without question. But this one was different. The evidence didn't just suggest misconduct, it mapped out something systematic, deliberate, and staggeringly bold. The kind of thing that, if proven, would require congressional testimony, inspector general reports, and the dismantling of networks that had operated unchecked for nearly a decade. He'd compiled everything into a single, meticulously organized file. 247 pages of documentation, cross-referenced and annotated. 63 exhibits. Testimony from 7 confidential sources, each corroborating elements the others couldn't have known. Financial records that showed money moving through channels designed to obscure its origin and destination. Communications that, while careful, weren't quite careful enough. And at the center of it all, names. Not just lower-level functionaries who'd followed orders, but the architects themselves, senior officials whose signatures appeared on authorizations they'd later claim never existed. Marcus had presented a preliminary summary to his direct supervisor 3 weeks ago. Eleanor Vasquez had reviewed it in silence, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, her expression neutral in that particular way that 15 years of civil service had perfected. When she'd finished, she'd looked up at him and said only, "This needs to go higher." Higher meant Assistant Director William Grayson, a man Marcus had met exactly twice in his career. Both times had been in large meetings where Grayson had said little but seemed to absorb everything, his eyes moving from speaker to speaker with the patience of someone who understood that information revealed itself in pauses as much as in words. The call had come this morning. Not from Grayson directly, but from his deputy chief of staff, a woman named Rachel Summerfield whose voice carried the efficient pleasantness of someone delivering a message she neither questioned nor cared about. "Assistant Director Grayson would like to meet with you this evening." 7 p.m. Conference room 714. This meeting is not on the official calendar. Please come alone and bring no materials. Confirm receipt of this message. Marcus had confirmed. Then he'd spent the rest of the day trying to work on other cases, failing, and finally giving up around 4 o'clock to walk to a coffee shop 6 blocks away where he sat and watched people who had normal jobs, normal concerns, normal Thursday afternoons that didn't end in windowless rooms. Now, at 6:54, he heard footsteps in the hallway. 2 sets, both measured and unhurried. The door opened without a knock. Eleanor Vasquez entered first, and for a half-second, Marcus felt relief at seeing a familiar face. She wore the same navy blazer she'd had on that morning, though she'd changed her blouse to something darker. Her expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes met his with something he couldn't quite name. Not a warning, exactly. More like a reminder of something they'd never explicitly discussed but both understood. Behind her came William Grayson. He was shorter than Marcus expected, maybe 5'9", with silver hair cut precisely and a charcoal suit that fit the way expensive suits do, so well you stopped noticing it was there. He must have been in his early 60s, but he moved with the deliberate efficiency of a much younger man. His face was distinguished rather than handsome, with lines that suggested he smiled more than he frowned, though he wasn't smiling now. Agent Chen. Grayson's voice was warm, almost gentle. Thank you for making time this evening. As if Marcus had a choice. As if this meeting were optional. Of course, sir. Eleanor closed the door behind them. The soft click of the latch seemed extraordinarily loud. Grayson moved to the chair directly across from Marcus, while Eleanor took the seat at the head of the table, equidistant from both men. The geometry of it struck Marcus immediately, not adversarial, not yet, but not collegial either. Triangulated. Balanced. I've reviewed your work, Grayson said, settling into his chair with the ease of someone accustomed to uncomfortable furniture. All of it. The preliminary summary you provided to Supervisor Vasquez, and the supporting documentation she forwarded to my office. Marcus nodded but said nothing. His training had taught him the power of silence in interrogations. He'd never imagined he'd need to deploy it as a subject. It's thorough, Grayson continued. Impressively so. The sourcing is solid. The financial analysis shows genuine expertise. And the implications, he paused, poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher, took a measured sip. The implications are significant. Still, Marcus waited. Which is why, Grayson said, setting down his glass with precision, we need to have a conversation about what happens next. In the silence that followed, Marcus became aware of his own breathing, the way his hands rested flat on the table, the coolness of the air against the back of his neck. Somewhere above them, probably on the 8th or 9th floor, someone was still working. He could hear the muffled sound of footsteps, a door closing, the ordinary sounds of a building that never fully slept. Eleanor shifted slightly in her chair. When Marcus glanced at her, she was looking at Grayson, her face carefully composed. Before we begin, Grayson said, and something in his tone made Marcus's pulse quicken despite himself, I need you to understand something, Agent Chen. This conversation is not being recorded. No notes will be taken. There will be no official record that this meeting occurred. When we leave this room, what was said here will exist only in memory. He leaned forward slightly, his hands folding together on the table. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Marcus understood. He understood completely. And that understanding settled into his chest like a stone. Yes, sir, he said quietly. I understand. Grayson nodded, satisfied. Good. Then let's talk about your investigation, and why it cannot proceed. Chapter 2, The Weight of Practical Considerations. Marcus felt the words land but couldn't quite process them. Cannot proceed. Not requires revision or needs additional evidence or any of the phrases he'd braced himself to hear. Cannot proceed. As if the investigation were a train that had simply run out of track. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. "I don't understand." Grayson's expression remained kind, almost paternal. This somehow made it worse. "I know you don't. And that's not a criticism, it's a function of where you sit versus where I sit. You've done excellent work, Agent Chen. Work that, in a different context, would likely earn you a commendation. But context is everything in our line of work." Eleanor still hadn't spoken. Marcus looked at her again, searching for some signal, some indication of where she stood. Her face gave nothing away. "With respect, sir," Marcus began, choosing his words carefully, "the evidence is substantial. Multiple sources, corroborating testimony, financial records that clearly show." "I've read every page," Grayson interrupted gently. "Twice, in fact. The evidence is compelling. That's not in dispute. Then I don't see how. Let me ask you something." Grayson leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "How long have you been with the agency?" 14 years. 14 years. Good. Then you've seen administrations change. You've watched priorities shift with new leadership. You understand that we don't operate in a vacuum, we're part of a larger ecosystem, one that includes Congress, the Justice Department, the White House, the media, the public. He paused. Each of those entities has its own interests, its own pressures, its own version of what justice looks like. Marcus felt something cold forming in his stomach. "Are you saying this is political?" "I'm saying everything is political, Agent Chen. That's not cynicism, it's reality. Your investigation identifies serious misconduct by senior officials in the previous administration. Officials who still have allies, who still have influence, who still command loyalty from significant portions of the bureaucracy we depend on to function. So we protect them because they're powerful." The words came out sharper than Marcus intended. Grayson didn't flinch. "We make practical decisions about what battles can be won and at what cost. If we pursue this investigation to its logical conclusion, public hearings, indictments, trials, what do you think happens?" Marcus opened his mouth, closed it. "I'll tell you what happens," Grayson continued. "The targets lawyer up with the best defense team's money can buy. They claim political persecution. Friendly media outlets run stories about weaponization of federal agencies. Congressional allies demand our budget be reviewed, our authorities questioned. And while we're fighting that battle, other investigations, active cases against genuine threats to national security, get starved for resources. Good agents like you get dragged into depositions and cross-examinations that have nothing to do with finding facts and everything to do with destroying credibility. So we do nothing." Marcus couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. "We do what's possible instead of what's ideal," Grayson said. "We accept that perfect justice is a luxury we can't always afford. We make trade-offs. We survive to fight battles we can actually win." Eleanor finally spoke. "Marcus." Her voice was quiet but firm. "Assistant Director Grayson isn't your enemy here. He's trying to help you understand the landscape." "The landscape." Marcus heard himself laugh, a short, bitter sound. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Agent Chen," Grayson said, and now there was steel beneath the warmth. "I need you to hear me clearly. This investigation ends tonight. The files will be archived under a classified designation. Your sources will be thanked for their service and released from any further obligation. The evidence you've gathered will remain sealed. And you will receive a new assignment, one that, I promise you, will make good use of your considerable talents." "And if I refuse?" The question came out before Marcus could stop it. The room went very quiet. Grayson studied him with something that might have been sadness. Or perhaps it was just professional assessment. "Then you'll find that your career with this agency has reached its natural conclusion," Grayson said softly. "Not through any official action, you understand. No termination on your record. But opportunities will dry up. Assignments will become routine, unrewarding. Your clearances will remain technically valid but somehow never quite sufficient for interesting work. And in a year, maybe two, you'll resign because there's nothing left here worth staying for. Marcus felt the trap close around him. This was why the meeting had no record. This was why no notes would be taken. In the morning, if he chose to fight, it would be his word against theirs, and they controlled the architecture of credibility. Or, Grayson continued, you accept that this is how things are, and you move forward. You keep doing good work. You build cases we can actually prosecute. You make a real difference in ways that don't require martyring yourself for a cause that's already lost. The air conditioning hummed. Someone's phone buzzed faintly in the hallway outside, then fell silent. Marcus looked at the water pitcher, the three glasses, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the table's surface. Everything in this room was exactly as it had been 10 minutes ago, except for him. He thought about the sources who'd trusted him. The hours of interviews conducted in parking garages and coffee shops and encrypted chat rooms. The careful promises he'd made that their testimony would matter, that truth would count for something. How long do I have to decide? He asked finally. You don't, Grayson said. Not unkindly. The decision has already been made. I'm just giving you the courtesy of understanding why. Marcus nodded slowly. He understood. He understood perfectly. And that understanding felt like drowning. Chapter 3, The Mathematics of Compromise. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He lay in his apartment in Arlington, watching shadows move across the ceiling as cars passed on the street below, their headlights creating brief geometries of light that dissolved as quickly as they formed. His mind kept returning to the conference room, replaying the conversation, searching for the moment when he might have said something different, pushed harder, found some leverage he'd missed. But there had been no leverage. That was the point. That was the entire architecture of what had happened. At 4:17 a.m., he gave up on sleep and made coffee. His apartment was small, efficiently furnished, the dwelling of someone who prioritized career over comfort, who told himself for years that the real life would begin later, after the important work was done. He sat at his kitchen table and watched the city wake up beyond his window. Delivery trucks making their rounds. Early shift workers heading to metro stations. People who got up and went to work and came home and didn't carry the weight of investigations that couldn't proceed. He'd joined the agency 14 years ago with the kind of idealism that now seemed almost quaint. Fresh out of graduate school, armed with a degree in forensic accounting and the certainty that institutions mattered, that rules meant something, that the system, despite its flaws, ultimately bent toward accountability. His parents had been proud. His father, who'd emigrated from Taiwan in the 70s and built a small accounting firm through careful, ethical work, had seen Marcus's choice as validation of everything he believed about America. You'll protect what's right, his father had said at his swearing-in ceremony. That's what matters. Marcus wondered what his father would say now. He'd passed away 3 years ago, spared from having to watch his son learn what compromise actually meant. By 7:30 a.m., Marcus was back at the office. He moved through security with his badge, rode the elevator to the 5th floor where his cubicle waited, identical to 40 others in the open-plan workspace. His desk held the usual architecture of bureaucratic life, a desktop computer, filing cabinets, a calendar that still showed last month because he never remembered to update it, and a coffee mug from a training conference in Baltimore that he'd attended 6 years ago. He logged into his computer and opened his email. There, waiting in his inbox, was a message from Eleanor Vasquez, timestamped 6:47 a.m. Subject line, New Assignment. He stared at it for a full minute before opening it. The email was brief and professional. He was being reassigned to a task force investigating healthcare fraud, a significant problem, certainly, involving millions in false billings and unnecessary procedures. Important work. Worthy work. The kind of case that would let him use his financial analysis skills and likely result in actual prosecutions. People would go to jail. Money would be recovered. The system would function exactly as designed. It was also completely, utterly, devastatingly safe. Marcus read the email 3 times, then archived it without responding. He sat in his cubicle, surrounded by the morning sounds of an office coming to life, keyboards clicking, coffee makers gurgling, colleagues greeting each other with the easy banter of people whose biggest concern was whether the meeting on their calendar would run long. His phone buzzed. A text from Eleanor, "Need to talk." "My office. 10 a.m. He didn't respond to that either. Instead, he opened the secure server where his investigation files were stored. Or had been stored. The folder was still there, but when he clicked on it, he got an access denied message. Already archived. Already sealed. Already erased from the official record of what the agency cared about. 11 months of work, disappeared in less than 12 hours. He thought about the sources. 7 people who'd risked their careers, their reputations, possibly their safety, to tell him what they knew. He'd promised them their testimony would matter. He'd looked them in the eye and said the words, "This will count. What you're doing matters." How many of them would ever trust a federal investigator again? At 9:45, Marcus stood and walked toward Eleanor's office. She had a real office, not a cubicle, a corner space with windows that looked out over the Potomac. When he knocked, she called for him to enter without looking up from her computer. "Close the door," she said. He did. Stood there, waiting. Eleanor finally looked at him. She'd been his supervisor for 6 years. He'd always respected her, trusted her judgment, believed she cared about the work. Now he wasn't sure what he believed. "You're angry," she said. It wasn't a question. "Am I allowed to be?" "Of course you are. I'd be worried if you weren't." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit. Please." He sat. "I know what you're thinking," Eleanor said. "That I should have fought harder. That I should have stood up to Grayson, pushed back, refused to participate in shutting down your investigation." Marcus said nothing. "And you're right to think that," she continued. "In an ideal world, that's exactly what I would have done. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in this one." She paused, measuring her words. "I have a daughter. She's 16. In 2 years, she'll be applying to colleges. I need this job, Marcus. I need the salary, the benefits, the stability. And if I become known as someone who doesn't understand how to play the game, who can't accept difficult decisions, who makes things harder than they need to be, I lose all of that. So we all just accept it." Marcus heard the bitterness in his own voice. "We all make our little compromises, protect our careers, and pretend we're still the good guys." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Don't you dare judge me for having priorities beyond this building. You're young enough that martyrdom still looks noble. Give it a few more years. See how your principles hold up when they're competing with mortgage payments and elderly parents who need care and all the other things that make up an actual human life." She was right, of course. That was the worst part. She was absolutely, completely right. Chapter 4, The Price of Clarity. Marcus didn't accept the healthcare fraud assignment. Not immediately. For 3 days, he came to work, sat at his desk, and did nothing. He read case files without absorbing them. He attended meetings without speaking. He existed in a state of suspended animation, watching his colleagues move through their days with an efficiency that now seemed almost alien to him. On the 4th day, Eleanor called him into her office again. "You need to make a decision," she said without preamble. "Accept the assignment or resign. Those are your options. There is no third path where you sit in your cubicle radiating disappointment and making everyone uncomfortable." "I haven't been." "Yes, you have. You think you're being subtle, but you're not. People notice. And it's creating problems." Marcus felt something snap inside him. Creating problems. We buried an investigation that documented systematic abuse of power, and I'm creating problems by being upset about it. Lower your voice. Why? Afraid someone might hear. Afraid the truth might leak out of this carefully controlled environment you've all built. Eleanor stood up, her face flushed. You self-righteous. She stopped herself, took a breath, sat back down. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. You think you're the first person to discover that the system is imperfect? That justice is selective? That power protects itself? Welcome to adulthood, Marcus. Welcome to the real world that the rest of us have been living in while you've been wrapped up in your moral certainty. So I should just accept it. Just move on. Yes. That's exactly what you should do. Unless you have a better plan. Unless you've figured out some way to change everything that I and 1,000 other people haven't thought of. She leaned forward. Do you have a plan, Marcus? Really? Or are you just angry and lost and trying to figure out how to feel like a good person again? The question hit him harder than he expected. Because she was right. He had no plan. He had anger and betrayal and a growing certainty that everything he believed about his work had been built on foundations far more fragile than he'd imagined. I have the files, he said quietly. Eleanor went very still. What? Copies. Before they were archived. I made copies. Jesus Christ, Marcus. She stood up again, moved to her door, checked that it was closed. Tell me you didn't. I did. Full documentation. Every exhibit. Every source interview. Everything. Where? Somewhere safe. Eleanor's face had gone pale. Do you understand what you've done? Copying classified materials without authorization, that's not just grounds for termination, that's criminal. They can prosecute you. They can put you in prison. Only if they admit the investigation existed, Marcus said. Only if they acknowledge what we found. And we both know they won't do that. So what's your plan? Leak it? Go to a journalist? Become a whistleblower? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think that ends well for you? You'll be destroyed. Your credibility will be shredded. Every mistake you've ever made, every corner you've ever cut, every ambiguous moment in your entire career will be excavated and weaponized. They'll paint you as unstable, politically motivated, a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. And by the time they're done, no one will believe anything you say. Maybe. But the evidence will be out there. People can judge for themselves. People don't judge evidence, Marcus. They judge stories. And the story will be about you, not about what you found. That's how this works. That's always how this works. Marcus stood up. I need to think. No, you need to destroy those files. Tonight. And then you need to accept the assignment and move on with your life before you do something that can't be undone. He walked toward the door. Marcus. Eleanor's voice stopped him. I'm trying to help you. I know you don't believe that right now, but I am. Please don't throw your life away for this. He left without responding. That night, Marcus sat in his apartment with his laptop open. The files were on an encrypted drive, backed up in 3 separate locations. 247 pages that documented something true and terrible and apparently untouchable. He thought about his sources. About the promises he'd made. About what it meant to be a person who kept promises or a person who made compromises. He thought about his father, who'd believed in systems and rules and the fundamental fairness of institutions. He thought about Eleanor, with her 16-year-old daughter and her college tuition payments and all the small, necessary compromises that added up to a life. He thought about Grayson, making practical decisions about what battles could be won. And he thought about himself, sitting in his small apartment at 11:37 p.m. on a Tuesday, holding evidence of something that mattered, trying to decide if he was brave enough to be the person he'd always imagined himself to be. His phone rang. Unknown number. He stared at it for 3 rings, then answered. Agent Chen. The voice was male, unfamiliar, calm. You don't know me, but we need to talk. About the files you've been keeping. About what happens if you make certain choices. About how many ways a person's life can become very difficult, very quickly, when they stop being cooperative. Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. Who is this? Someone who's trying to help you understand your situation. You have something that doesn't belong to you. Return it. Accept your new assignment. Move on. These are not suggestions. And if I don't? A pause. Then we'll have a different conversation. One you won't enjoy. The line went dead. Marcus sat in the darkness of his apartment, his heart pounding, his mind racing through implications and consequences and all the ways that truth could be made to disappear. He knew, in that moment, that he'd already made his decision. Perhaps he'd made it 3 days ago, or 11 months ago, or 14 years ago when he'd first sworn his oath. He opened his laptop and began composing an email to a journalist he'd never met, at a newspaper he'd never contacted, about an investigation that officially didn't exist. His hands shook as he typed. But he typed anyway. Chapter 5, The Architecture of Aftermath. The story ran 6 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in November. Front page, above the fold. Federal investigation into senior officials secretly shut down, documents reveal systematic misconduct. The byline belonged to a veteran investigative reporter named Sarah Keem, who'd spent 3 weeks verifying Marcus's documents before agreeing to publish. Marcus read it on his phone while sitting in a rental apartment in Philadelphia, 200 miles from Washington. He'd resigned from the agency the day after sending the files. Hadn't waited for termination, hadn't negotiated, hadn't tried to salvage anything. Just walked into Eleanor's office, placed his badge and credentials on her desk, and left the building for the last time. The article was thorough, careful, devastating. It laid out the evidence methodically, included responses from all the named officials, denials, mostly, accusations of political motivation, questions about the authenticity of documents. But the financial records didn't lie. The communications, once exposed to daylight, revealed their meaning clearly. The pattern was undeniable. By Monday morning, 3 congressional committees had announced investigations. By Tuesday, the Justice Department issued a statement promising to review the matters raised. By Wednesday, one of the named officials had retained a high-profile defense attorney and begun making the rounds on cable news, calling the revelations a politically orchestrated hit job. Marcus watched it all unfold from a distance, his phone buzzing constantly with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Reporters. Lawyers. Unknown voices offering support or threats or unsolicited advice. He answered none of them. Eleanor texted once, "You did what you thought you had to do. I hope it was worth it." He didn't respond to that either. The preliminary congressional hearing took place in December. Marcus wasn't called to testify. His status as the source of leaked classified materials made him legally complicated, and both parties seemed content to treat him as a ghost, a necessary catalyst who could now be safely ignored. Instead, the officials he'd investigated appeared before cameras, looking grave and dignified, expressing appropriate concern while carefully maintaining their innocence. The questioning was sharp but unfocused. Representatives grandstand for their constituents. Witnesses deflected with practiced ease. Lawyers objected on procedural grounds. And slowly, inexorably, the story began to lose its momentum. Other scandals emerged. Elections loomed. The news cycle, relentless and indifferent, moved on. By February, the Justice Department announced that after careful review, they'd found insufficient evidence to warrant prosecution. Some procedural violations, perhaps. Some ambiguous judgment calls. But nothing that rose to the level of criminal conduct. The investigation Marcus had built was mentioned in a footnote. He read the announcement in a coffee shop in Philadelphia, where he'd been working as a freelance financial consultant for small nonprofits. The work was fine. It paid enough. It meant nothing. That evening, he received an email from one of his sources. A woman who'd worked in the budget office, who'd shown him the documents that proved systematic diversion of funds. She wrote, "I don't regret talking to you. I need you to know that what they did was wrong. It's still wrong, even if nothing happens to them. Thank you for trying." Marcus read it 3 times. Then he closed his laptop and went for a walk. The city was cold, the streets slick with half-melted snow. He walked for hours, past row houses and corner stores and churches with their doors locked against the night. He thought about his father, about promises and principles and the distance between what should be and what is. He thought about Grayson, who'd been exactly right about how this would unfold. He thought about Eleanor, still working her cases, still paying her mortgage, still making the compromises necessary to survive. And he thought about himself, unemployed and unmoored, living in a city where no one knew his name, wondering if what he'd done had mattered at all. The truth was out there now. That counted for something. It had to count for something. Didn't it? Marcus stopped at a bridge overlooking the Schuylkill River. The water moved slowly beneath him, dark and cold, reflecting nothing. He stood there for a long time, watching it flow toward destinations it didn't choose, following paths carved by forces beyond its control. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. Another unknown number. Another voice that wanted something from him, answers, justification, ammunition for arguments he'd never agreed to have. He pulled out the phone, looked at it, then silenced it and put it away. Above him, clouds obscured the stars. Around him, the city hummed with its 1,000 small dramas, its million quiet compromises, its endless accommodation with imperfection. Marcus stood on the bridge, alone, and tried to remember why he'd thought truth mattered more than the cost of telling it. The answer, if there was one, remained just beyond reach, like justice itself, visible enough to pursue, distant enough to remain forever unattained. He turned from the river and walked back into the city, carrying with him the weight of what he'd done and the knowledge that it would never be enough, and the faint, stubborn hope that perhaps, someday, somehow, it might still count for something after all. The end.